We are back with our reflective research essay assignment sheet. I briefly went over the first part last time, the what of it, as we were going into the Civil War archives and looking for that primary source material to use in this essay. So now that we've narrowed our sources, or primary sources, down to two possibilities, it's time for us to choose. And I mean, we might still look at both as we go into our secondary source research and just see what hits we get and what sort of secondary source information is coming back, and that could help us decide between the two. But for the most part, what I was seeing in your initial explanations of the primary sources were most of you, and by most I mean everyone, had the possibility for finding a lot of secondary sources on either of the primary ones you chose to go with. I did note, however, for some people that we needed to make our questions a little bit more broad, and we're just not going to find the really specific information about a lot of the people writing these letters and diaries. There's a few of them who became bigger names and will have more work done on them, but the majority of these people, these primary source materials, that's all we have about them, so we won't be able to do secondary research that's specific to their individual experiences. But, right, taking that step back, we can do research into people groups like them having similar experiences to better understand what they're writing about and the perspectives that are coming out in their letters and diaries. And that ultimately is the goal of this paper. So again, thinking back to the Foyer's example of my life as a dog, right? Starting with questions and then sort of doing research to understand everything from his dog's behavior to like human interactions with animals and attachment to animals and things like that. And so similarly, starting with our letters and diaries, those moments and things that those people are saying and representing in those letters and diaries, and moving out to find our secondary sources that are going to help us make sense of that experience and what it means and interpret it. And so throughout, when we go to write this actual paper, you'll be moving back and forth between your primary and secondary sources, and going down those sort of different avenues of inquiry that arise as you move forward. And so right now this week, we're working on finding those sources that are going to help us do that, the secondary sources, right? So we can go back and look at the video again of the difference between primary and secondary sources. And so now we're looking at what sources are going to help us better understand our primary sources. That is the goal. And that paper, that reflective research, right? It's that moving back and forth between the two and thinking about how it goes both directions, right? Like how the secondary source helps us understand the primary source material, but also how our primary sources and that like personal experience and anecdotes and things that they're putting in their letters and diaries help us get a better sense of that secondary source material on a personal level, right? We can talk about it more broadly, which a lot of the secondary sources give that historical background. They'll move through what was going on at the time, giving us a lot of the context. And then our primary sources are really giving us that personal element and what it looks like on that individual basis. So, right, it can go back and forth and move in a lot of different ways. And so that is our goal as we're finding our sources, moving in towards this, writing the reflective research essay. And we want our sources to be helpful. And so part of this really goes back to the line of inquiry that we're able to set up, and then go into that research for the secondary source. So, we have that we're replacing the traditional thesis statement with that inquiry, whether it's in a question form or like the statement form of a question, which we'll talk about more later on. And that is really what's driving this paper, is just questions. But again, we want questions that are broad enough that we can find the sources to sort of answer them. Maybe it's not a direct answer, but right, like move towards a direction. We also want how and why questions over what questions, right? Because what is too informative, and like the how and why can include the informative element, which is great and what we want, but it leads to like more complex thinking, right? And that's what we saw in the foyer, My Life as a Dog, that he sort of moved into much more complex issues connected to dog ownership in the city, and went down some different avenues. And the only reason he was able to do that is because he was asking much larger questions, more complex questions that didn't necessarily have a simple answer of like, okay, what is, or what were the requirements to serve in the military, right? Like, that's just like information, but it doesn't really get at the heart of something. And so trying to like reshape it, right? Like, how did the soldiers' backgrounds make them better fit for serving, right? Like, that changes it. And so think about that as you work with your questions in order to find your secondary sources for this paper.